The freezing drizzle comes down over a torn stretch of road outside Nancy, France in November 1944. Beside a charred wooden telegraph pole stands 21-year-old Private Gene Kelly of the 304th Signal Battalion, resting a hand against the copper wire splicing tool tucked into his leather belt holster. Artillery bursts rumble in the distance, but Kelly does not look up at the sky or down at the mud. The primary communications line connecting division headquarters to the forward infantry lies severed 20 feet above the frozen ground. Without hesitation, Kelly jams his boots against the wooden ladder, pulls himself upward into the drifting smoke, and reaches for the frayed wire. Mortar shells walk toward the road, shaking the pole and vibrating the rungs beneath his feet. Down below, tires spray slush as a command staff car screeches to a halt in the sleet. Kelly never turns his head. He leans out over the top rung, grips the burning line and shouts down into the gloom. "Keep this ladder steady or we drop the circuit." Every man on the road freezes. Corporal Mark Sullivan lowers his wire spool, his hands locking as 3 silver stars glint on the collar of an approaching heavy wool overcoat. General George S. Patton stops at the base of the ladder, staring up through the drizzle without saying a word. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether an infantry regiment lost its voice in the middle of an assault, and the answer was not what anyone on that road was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden history of the front line. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it meant for Gene Kelly to bark an order at 3 silver stars, you need to understand what a signal line actually was in November 1944. It was not just wire strung across wooden posts. It was the living nervous system of an advancing army. Outside Nancy, in the freezing sleet of the Lorraine campaign, mud swallowed heavy trucks up to their axles and turned shallow ditches into waterlogged trenches. Radio signals in those dense forests were notoriously unreliable, drowned out by heavy rainfall, wet timber, and German jamming. That left field wire, twisted, rubber-coated copper carrying the direct voice of command, when an artillery burst sheared a line, the assault ground to a dead halt. Fixing it was not a job for officers in warm tents. It belonged to young men hanging 20 feet in the air off dripping wooden crossarms, working with frozen fingers while shrapnel clipped the branches around them. Up on those telegraph poles, there was no cover, no trench, and nowhere to run. A signalman was simply a clear target against a grey sky. In the Third Army, military hierarchy was absolute law. A private did not speak to a general unless spoken to, and he certainly did not shout down at 3 stars, as if addressing a casual recruit. Under strict protocol, commanding a high-ranking officer to hold a wooden ladder steady in the slush was unheard of. Every soldier standing along that stretch of road knew the fierce reputation of George S. Patton Jr. He was a commander who demanded rigid discipline, fining men for missing tie clasps or unbuttoned wool overcoats. To issue an abrupt command to such a man was to risk an explosive confrontation that could ruin a soldier's military life in seconds. The men watching from the mud performed the same rapid calculation, waiting for the thunderous response they all expected. Yet the operational arithmetic of November 1944 cared nothing for rank or military protocol. A severed wire line was not a minor technical issue. It was a deadly operational failure. Without that circuit, forward infantry advancing into machine gun fire had no way to call for supporting artillery. Every single minute the line remained dead translated into a brutal mathematical sum. 60 seconds without contact meant 30 uncoordinated mortar rounds, delayed evacuations for the wounded, and dozens of riflemen caught in the open without smoke cover. It was a simple calculation of time against human survival, where a tight copper splice mattered far more than military etiquette. And that was the road Gene Kelly was working on. Picture the scene. The grey afternoon light over Nancy was fading fast under a blanket of freezing drizzle. Along the narrow embankment, a dozen men from the signal crew crouched in the wet slush, the metallic tang of burned rubber and ozone heavy in the air. Down in the mud, Corporal Mark Sullivan stood frozen, a heavy wooden wire reel locked between his knees, his raw, ungloved fingers stiff from the cold. Above them, 20 feet off the frozen mud, Private Gene Kelly hung from his climbing leather, his weight leaning hard into the wooden ladder as smoke curled up from the crossarm. And right at the base of that pole stood General George S. Patton, his wet wool overcoat dark at the shoulders, 3 silver stars dull in the sleet. Nobody on that road dared to draw a full breath. The officers and signalmen watching from the ditches were making a rapid, terrifying calculation. They all knew Patton's fierce reputation. They knew his legendary intolerance for poor discipline, his sharp temper, and his ruthless expectation of absolute military deference. A private high in the air had just barked a crude, abrupt command at a three-star general, treating the commander of the Third Army like an unranked recruit. Every witness braced for the explosion, waiting for Patton to roar, order Kelly off the pole, or throw him in the stockade. Stay with me, because what happened next on that freezing road is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from the 304th Signal Battalion are remarkably consistent in shape. They recall the heavy silence falling over the mud, the distant hum of mortar shells, and the absolute rigidity of every soldier standing along that embankment as the commander of the Third Army moved toward the pole. Patton did not reach for his ivory-handled revolver, not the way a commanding officer reacts to a breach of discipline, not the way a three-star general looks at a low-ranking soldier who has just shouted an order at his collar. He looked at the severed line, then at the ladder slipping in the thawing slush, and he stepped directly into the mud. Reaching out with both gloved hands, Patton grabbed the wooden side rails of the ladder, set his boots deep into the freezing earth, and braced his weight solid against the wood. He held it frozen and completely immovable while Private Kelly worked 20 feet above him, stripping rubber casing and weaving copper strands with raw, bleeding fingers. For nearly 60 seconds, no one on that road moved or spoke. The general stood anchored in the slush, his dark wool coat wet with drizzle, feeling every tremor of Kelly's boots as the young signalman crimped the connection tight. Up top, Kelly tapped the wire, heard the crackle of the division circuit returning to life, and secured the junction to the wooden crossarm. As Kelly began his slide down the ladder, Patton released his grip, wiped his wet gloves against his overcoat, and gave the signalman a single, silent nod. Corporal Mark Sullivan, watching from 10 paces away, would later describe Patton's response with one word. Deliberate. Patton turned without saying a word, walked back to his command vehicle, and pulled the door shut. See, what most folks don't realize is that Patton was a commander obsessed with operational velocity above everything else. In the brutal arithmetic of high command strategy, military protocol was useful only as long as it accelerated victory on the battlefield. The moment formal hierarchy threatened to slow down an urgent operational necessity, Patton discarded the performance of rank without a moment of hesitation. He understood instantly what every other officer on that road was too paralyzed to grasp. At that exact moment in time, a 21-year-old private with a copper splicing tool in his leather holster was the single most vital asset in the entire Third Army sector. If Kelly fell or dropped that circuit, an entire infantry regiment advancing through the snow beyond Nancy would go blind and deaf under enemy fire. Patton did not hold that ladder out of generosity or sentiment. He held it because he was a master of warfare who recognized pure, practical competence when he saw it. Down in the freezing slush, rank could not fix a severed wire. Physical leverage and steady hands did. By putting his weight against those wooden rungs, Patton ensured that the machinery of war kept moving forward without losing a single second. It was a quiet, pragmatic recognition that on a front line, the man doing the work commands the space, regardless of how many stars are on his chest. Gene Kelly was 21 years old, born and raised in a tight-knit row house in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His father spent 35 years working as a cable splicer for the city power company, coming home every evening with coal dust under his fingernails and copper shavings embedded in the soles of his work boots. From the time Gene was 12, his father taught him how to skin insulation with a pocket knife, splice wire without leaving a burr, and trust his harness when hanging 40 feet above asphalt. By 19, Gene was working as a lineman for Bell Telephone, climbing poles along the Schuylkill River in bitter winter storms. He had a younger sister named Mary and a girl named Clara who worked behind the counter at a local bakery on Broad Street, saving her letters in a ribboned shoebox. Gene did not plan on making a career out of the army. He planned to return to Philadelphia, earn his senior lineman certification, buy a modest brick house 3 blocks from his parents, and raise a family. When the war drafted him into the 304th Signal Battalion, he brought along the copper wire splicing tool in his leather belt holster, the very tool his father had given him before he boarded the troop train. He was not a romantic man looking for glory in Europe. He was not a hero seeking medals in the mud. He was the kind of man who looked at a severed line and saw a physical job that needed finishing before dark. When the splicing was finished and the command car pulled away into the drizzle, the signal crew gathered around the pole, staring up at Kelly in stunned disbelief. Corporal Mark Sullivan asked him if he realized he had just barked an order at General Patton. Kelly did not boast or celebrate. He simply wiped the grease off his raw fingers with a scrap of burlap, checked the tension on the newly spliced copper line, and asked if the truck had brought up fresh dry gloves. To Kelly, holding the ladder was not a legendary story. It was just basic mechanics. If a ladder shifts in the mud, you hold it. If a circuit breaks, you fix it. Corporal Mark Sullivan was 23 years old during that frozen afternoon outside Nancy. Hailing from the rail town of Scranton, Pennsylvania, he survived the winter campaign in the Ardennes, maintaining communications through the heavy shelling of the Battle of the Bulge, and returned home to Scranton in early 1946. Sullivan took a job with the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, spending 30 years as a yard foreman, raising 4 children, and serving as a local scoutmaster. He rarely talked about the intense combat he witnessed across Western Europe, but whenever he saw line crews working on high utility poles in severe weather or watched a young man grip a ladder against high winds, he would tell his family about the day a signalman from Philadelphia shouted at a 3-star general, and George Patton held the ladder steady in the slush without saying a single word. Was General Patton right to accept an order from a private and hold that slipping wooden ladder steady in the slush? Some would say that allowing a low-ranking signalman to bark commands at a 3-star general undermines the essential structure of military hierarchy. In a giant war effort where millions of men must obey without question, strict discipline requires absolute deference to rank regardless of the physical mud or the urgency of the moment. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that practical leadership demands knowing when rigid military protocol must give way to operational reality. On a shell-torn road outside Nancy, securing a copper circuit was the only calculation that mattered, and holding those wooden rungs kept an entire regiment alive. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.